Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to History Behind the Headlines, U.S. Intervention in Latin America. I'm Sarah Weichsel. I'm the Executive Director of the American Historical Association. History Behind the Headlines events are designed to bring together leading scholars to discuss the historical context for pressing current events. And today, we'll be discussing the history of intervention by the United States in Latin American affairs and politics. Since the beginning of this year, the United States has arrested the president of Venezuela, imposed a blockade around Cuba, and issued threats to other Latin American nations under the authority of President Trump's newly proclaimed Don-roe Doctrine. To guide our conversation about these events, we're very fortunate to have as our moderator Vinson III, a historian of Latin America and the African diaspora, the presidential research professor at the Baker Nord Institute at Case Western University, and the current past president of the American Historical Association. Ben has served as president of the Conference on Latin American History as well, and is formerly the 18th president of Howard University. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and his book, Before Mestizaje, The Frontiers of Race and Caste in Colonial Mexico, earned the 2019 Howard F. Klein Book Prize. I'm now going to hand things over to Ben. Thank you all for being here with us today.
Sarah, thank you so much for that introduction. And I just want to pick up quickly on a point that you said. Really, when the United States launched Operation Absolute Resolve and captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, on January 3rd, 2026, it is hard not to ignore the capture as part of a larger story of U.S. interventionism in Latin America. And today, we're going to be exploring that. Our goal is historical understanding, identifying patterns and ruptures and possible futures. And we have an incredible and highly knowledgeable panel that is going to be able to provide us with insight both into the situation in Venezuela, but also in the broader Caribbean and Latin America. Let me introduce them to you. Our presenters include Dr. George Reid Andrews, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the author of many books and most recently has pulled together Voices of the Race, Black Newspapers in Latin America, 1870 to 1960. His awards include the 2025 Distinguished Service Award from the Conference of Latin American History and many, many other accolades. I would also like to bring to this discussion Dr. Jurgen Buchenau, who is the Dowd Term Professor of Capitalism Studies and Professor of History and Latin American Studies at UNC Charlotte. He also is the author of numerous books, including the forthcoming book, The United States and Mexico, Unequal Neighbors. He is also the former executive director of the Conference on Latin American History. It is also my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lillian Guerra, who, full disclosure, we were classmates at Dartmouth in the same year. It's just a delight to share this Zoom call with you, Lillian. She is a professor of Cuban and Caribbean history at the University of Florida, and she also is the author of many scholarly articles and essays and 5 books of history, most recently, Patriots and Traitors in Revolutionary Cuba, 1961 to 1981. This is the 3rd of her trilogy on the Cuban Revolution. She is also a frequent commentator on contemporary Cuba. Her contributions include several works of public history, as well as several books of photography, including The Idea of Cuba. Dr. Alejandro Velasco rounds out our panel, and he is the Associate Dean for Faculty at NYU's Gallatin School, and he is Associate Professor in NYU's Department of History. He is the former executive editor of the NACLA Report on the Americas, and his commentary and analysis have appeared in publications and media platforms across print, radio, and television. His first book was Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. This is our panel, and I think we should go ahead and kick things off, guys, if you don't mind. Let's explore some of the vital historical background and context for what we're facing today. This is one for everyone. Panel, how should we view the interventionism that we've been seeing in Venezuela as part of a larger story of Latin America. To begin broadly, how should we actually begin to define U.S. interventionism in Latin America? What counts, and what might we be overlooking as we do that? So, whoever would like to start, please do. And I think Jurgen is speaking, but you will have to, if you don't
Yeah,
mind, put
sure.
your unmute, and then we'll go to Lillian.
Yeah, I think I'll begin this simply because I'm a Mexicanist. And of course, Mexico has a very long history with the United States, and it's also really kind of representative of a particular form of intervention, which is the most severe one, territorial annexation. Nothing is more severe than taking land. And of course, Mexico lost half of its land to the United States in the 19th century. And we currently see the same dynamic in the U.S. designs on Greenland and on Canada, on Panama Canal. So we see that annexationist impulses are alive and well. So if we were to provide a typology of intervention, I think that would be one. Then Mexico was also subject to regime change. As early as 1859, President James Buchanan was trying to figure out whether the liberals or the conservatives would be more amenable to his cause. And following two abortive treaties to get transit rights through Mexico, he actually supported the liberals via a naval blockade outside Veracruz. So I think blockades and regime changes are yet another form. Then the third form, of course, is what we might call gunboat diplomacy. And that, I think, really is kind of presaged by the Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. But interestingly, and I think differently from today, it was never completely unilateral. President Roosevelt worked with the major Latin American powers, particularly Mexico, Chile, and Brazil, as basically as enforcers. And then, of course, you had the military interventions in Cuba and Central America of the 1920s. Then the final version, I think, that I would talk about is pressure, or basically more subtle intervention, basically to make the Latin Americans do the dirty work, but provide essential help. Good examples of that, of course, are the 1954 coup in Guatemala, or the 1973 coup in Chile.
Thank you for that start, Jurgen. Why don't we go around a little bit and see, get some other insights? And Lily, would you like to jump in here?
Yes. So I would definitely say that one of the things that changes in the equation and the definition of what is U.S. interventionism is the 30-year war that Cuba launches together with Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is supposed to also be achieving its independence in certain parts of these three different wars over the course of 30 years. But when Cuba launches its first war in 1868 and then is fighting a third war in the 1890s, it is a highly organized Republican arms, mostly based in terms of its headquarters in the United States, in New York, in Florida, but there are hundreds of revolutionary clubs across the country, in Europe, in parts of Central America, and it really poses an enormous threat to U.S. power. First, because in very stark ways, Cuba's Revolutionary Army was constitutive, as well as its civilian wing, of a desegregated society in becoming. And Cuba's army was the only desegregated by race army in the world. It also had eventually 26 women who earned the rank of captain in the liberating army. So in many respects, just aside from its own platform, which was destruction of plantation economy, creation of a sovereign state that would redistribute land and rid Cuba of the legacies of slavery that were still present in that plantation economy, it represented a possibility of having Black people hold power with inequality with whites, but also over whites, that meaning that whites could imagine voting for a black president once Cuba consolidated its sovereignty. So all of those factors posed an enormous threat to how the United States, and certainly in Washington, was conceiving itself and conceiving what its future should look like and with whom it should be negotiating that future. So to make a real clear point, when the United States does intervene in the Cuban Revolution of 1898, many Americans opposed it. There was a huge debate over whether the United States was truly an empire, because to go abroad, to go beyond its continental borders, was somewhat different than simply conquering land that was already in the West, that might have been part of our, quote, destiny, etc., that was part of Mexico. And so this idea as well that the Constitution had always followed the flag, and that Cuba and Puerto Rico, and eventually it would be Guam, it would be the Philippines, it would be parts of the Mariana Islands, all of these places that were abroad would somehow not have the same rights, their people would not have the same rights despite our presence there, was abhorrent to what it meant to be American. So when all of that comes true, and the only reason really Cuba doesn't become a colony of the United States is that when the United States intervenes and eventually occupies the island, there are still, thousands of Cubans who are lobbying in the United States, who are on the island, who had just fought this war, and really nag, I want to say nag, U.S. officials into recognizing that there has to be a negotiation of terms. So we get in Cuba another parallel model to direct colonization, which I would argue expands it across Central America and Latin America in many respects. And that's a neocolonial model where you use military intervention, military might, episodically sometimes. You don't have to be there continuously. You can use it episodically in order to bully the local government into espousing foreign interests before the interests of the majority of citizens. That's the definition of a neocolony. And what we have today in Donald Trump is a return to that form of U.S. foreign policy, where the goal is ultimately not the democratization of any of these countries in which we are either bombing or we are intimidating or in some way manipulating. The goal is simply control of their natural resources, their economy, for the purposes of enriching a few in this country and allegedly fulfilling some kind of mandate that so allegedly Americans feel that we must be in some way an empire or we're not a powerhouse in ways that are respectable and honorable throughout the world. So I think that we are right now, and at the cusp of an enormous, potentially enormous era of history. It's a historical juncture that if we don't intervene now as historians, it will be eclipsed. Our opportunity to change its course will be eclipsed.
Thank you for that. This is really getting under the hood here. Let me, if you don't mind, Alejandro, I'd love to invite you in on this a bit. If maybe talking a bit about from a Venezuelan perspective, are there forms of intervention that people experience as deeply consequential, but that outsiders might not recognize? I don't know if that helps to even push this a little bit further. I'd invite you to speak to that as well as the initial question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ben. So one of, I think, the surprising components of this story is that for the better part of the 20th century, which is to say almost the entirety of the 20th century, Venezuela and the United States had actually quite close and cordial relations. Much of that was founded on the relationship around oil and its exploitation by U.S. and European and other countries' industries to develop Venezuela's oil economy, both prior to the explosion of oil and its centrality in the 20th century, and then, of course, as oil became peak as a natural resource later in the century. But especially in the last 40 years of the 20th century, Venezuela's relationship with the United States was not just cordial, it was in fact quite close. in political matters, in military matters, and certainly in economic matters. In the 1960s, Venezuela was seen as an extremely useful partner, especially in the context of the Cuban Revolution. In the 1970s, Venezuela emerged as a close partner, especially as the oil industry was nationalized, rather than the system that had happened or the way that nationalization happened in Mexico in the late 30s. This was a much more congenial, coordinated process between U.S. companies and the national oil company in Venezuela by 1976. And so part of the story here is the significant deterioration of relations between the United States and Venezuela over the course of the 21st century and during the presidency of Hugo Chavez, who became president in 1999. Although it's important to highlight that even during the Chavez presidency, it wasn't a story of immediate anti-Americanism or anti-imperialism. In fact, his first few years in office, he had quite close relations with Bill Clinton when they overlapped. And it wasn't until after 9/11, and in particular the bombing campaign on Afghanistan, that Hugo Chavez started to critique the United States in terms of its neocon and imperialist, neo-imperialist vision, and especially around the invasion of Iraq. And so part of the story here, in terms of your question, what might be surprising, is that on the one hand, of course, the idea of the United States directly intervening and in fact bombing, and it should be very well noted that despite the claims that it was a bloodless or perfect mission, over 100 Venezuelans died during the operation. Many dozens of Cubans that were attached to the security detail of Nicolás Maduro also died. So real death toll here in the operation. But part of what's been surprising is that Venezuelans are not by nature, say, an anti-American people, right? And so part of the confusion and uncertainty and anxiety is kind of welcoming of the ouster of Maduro. There's very little love lost for him among the broad swath of Venezuelans, even those who, considered themselves once Chavistas, or perhaps even so today. And this sense of, well, we're not quite sure what this moment means in terms of U.S. control over the country. And especially given the very mixed signals around a regime change that does not seem like a regime change. Most of the same players that were there on January 2nd remained in power in January 4th, in terms of those around Nicolás Maduro. And so, that highlights questions about, to your first question, what does this form of intervention look like? Is this different from, is this similar to, is it innovating a kind of hybrid form that's more like the early 20th century, as Jurgen and Lillian were mentioning? Or is this something that's more naked around, saying the quiet part loud? We're not, we're not hiding behind the idea of some ideological goals. We're there for the oil. That's their primary, as Lillian said, that's our primary aim. And yet we're partnering with these folks who we had previously said were, a corrupt dictatorial regime, right? And so what does that mean? So that's also suggests that even in the 3 months since the attack on Venezuela, much has happened, but many, many questions remain very open in terms of what U.S. intervention means, what this means for Venezuela, and really what this means for the hemisphere and the world going forward.
Alejandro, that's a wonderful assessment, and actually sets up maybe a way I can ask Reid to kind of push this a little bit even further, because it's one thing for this to be seen from outside, interventionism to be read from U.S. soil, from other soils internationally, but to what extent I'm going to keep the initial question on the table. But to what extent do these types of interventions, how are they remembered and maybe even minimized as internal constituencies kind of wrestle with the implications of interventionism? So just a slight shade on the question for you, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind. I'm happy to be here. And we, of course, have been talking about very aggressive forms of intervention that have big consequences and that are quite visible and quite easy to criticize. I'd like us to remember that this is not the only way in which foreign policy can be conducted. That if the purpose of intervention, the concept of intervention, is to take action to produce certain consequences that your nation is seeking, to seek certain outcomes that are in your national interest, there have been moments in US history where the US has opted for much softer forms of intervention and, in fact, of seeking to exert influence rather than intervening aggressively. And the most really striking period of that kind of conduct of foreign policy was during the good neighbor years of the Roosevelt administration, which took place precisely in reaction to the kind of manifest failures of the violent interventions of the first 20 to 30 years of the 20th century. The US repudiated those interventions, and the right of intervention repudiated the Roosevelt corollary in 1930 and under Herbert Hoover, of all people, and then again in 1934 under Roosevelt. And then Roosevelt went on to pioneer programs of economic aid, of diplomatic courting of Latin American nations, and this paid off hugely with Latin America aligning with the United States in World War II to combat fascism. More recently, I find myself thinking of USAID, an agency that, again, is very easy to criticize. Not all of its programs have been the most positive in their impacts, but folks, I recently read an article in The Lancet which argued that USAID had saved 92 million lives in the world over the last 20 years, or the first 20 years of the 21st century. AID is part of US efforts surely to influence what is going on in other nations and to bring them closer to the United States. And it worked. And it had positive, and folks, conversely, the destruction of AID means 1 million people dead last year, and because of the programs that had been eliminated, and millions more in the years to come. So it's correct to focus on our violent forms of intervention. Let's try to remember also our peaceful forms of intervention and what tremendously positive consequences they have had, particularly in contrast to the violent ones. Then a second point, to take things a little broader, if I might. And it might take us a little bit off target, but I feel I have to bring it up. That this talk about intervention, at this very moment, the US government is intervening in the most forceful way possible against the Latin American population of the United States. And we all know what is going on. 300,000 to 400,000 people arrested, imprisoned just last year. There will be hundreds of thousands more, maybe several million more this year and the years to come. This is catastrophic. It's socially catastrophic. It's economically catastrophic, culturally catastrophic, et cetera, and part of a pattern in which the administration acts illegally outside our borders and acts illegally inside our borders. And of course, this affects not just people of Latin American ancestry, it affects every American citizen, several of whom have died in this campaign of repression. So on the one hand, I try to be optimistic by looking at our foreign policy successes in the past. And on the other hand, I'm deeply worried about the way in which government aggression asserts itself, not only within the region of Latin America, but against Latin American people and US citizens in the United States. It's a bad moment.
Reid, that's a very interesting insight and perspective. Truly a boomerang interventionism effect, reciprocal interventionism effect that we should probably continue to theorize and contextualize, especially in this more transnational world that we are increasingly living in. I invite all of us to kind of ponder that thought a bit more. And Reid, it just also, you invocated or invoked, if you will, these previous moments, and in fact, all of us have, all of you have, to some extent. And I'm just going to reflect on this quickly because I think our audience, sometimes when they think of interventionism in Latin America, sometimes they think of 1954 Guatemala. Sometimes they think of Chile in 1973. Sometimes they think of Panama in 1989. Just quickly, round robin, how does what's been happening now, especially the capture of Maduro, maybe a few words, how does it compare to some of these more classic if you will, at least in the social imagination of our country. Any thoughts on how this particular form that we've been living through since January kind of compares? And maybe I'll boomerang back around. George, Reid, if you want to start, that'd be good.
I have been thinking about this, and of course there are so many echoes of previous interventions. I guess the one that it strikes me as most resembling is the 1989 episode in Panama. There aren't that many moments in which the U.S. invades a foreign country, seizes the head of state, and makes off with him. It could have been her, but it's always him, makes off with him to the United States. A couple of key differences, though. One is that in almost all of these interventions in the second half of the century, that the US made at least some effort to try to get UN backing for what it was doing and tried to get OAS backing for what it was doing, including in the Panama intervention. It failed completely at that time. Both the UN and the OAS condemned, well, the UN tried to condemn. Of course, the United States vetoed the Security Council resolution condemning the Panama invasion, but it at least made the effort. It felt it needed to legitimate itself internationally. None of that in 2026. Go in alone, don't even consult Congress, no allies, no approval. We don't give a good whatever about international opinion. We're just going to do this. That's one key difference. Oh, damn. And of course, I've forgotten the second one, and which is too bad because it was so awesome. But anyway, if it comes to me, I'll jump back in and insert it. But please push on to other people.
Thank you. I'll hopscotch a bit. Lily, any thoughts? And then Alejandro, and then Jurgen.
Okay, I have lots of thoughts, but I'm going to be efficient and cogent. First of all, I agree. The Panama case in 1989 was a policing action, as it was described by George Bush at the time. But it was also a cover-up of our own policies. Noriega had been a longtime CIA agent receiving a regular salary since 1956. He knew a hell of a lot about what we had been doing in the 1980s, including our operations to ensure that money would get to the Contras when the Congress had denied that funding. And so remember, all of us, the Iran-Contra, quote, scandal, unquote. So what did the Marines do besides take Noriega? They stole 26,000 boxes of material from his compound. That was his archive. And I know from students who have tried to get Freedom of Information Acts fulfilled to get some of that material released, it is completely secret and under wraps. So there's a lot that went into that operation. It's a cover-up. Then I want to say that the concessionary policies of the Good Neighbor program of FDR, those are definitely softer forms of intervention. On the other hand, what was FDR having to deal with? Well, he was having to deal with the chickens coming home to roost, meaning that he effectively had to deal with dictatorships that had been, in some cases, installed directly by U.S. military occupations. So we have the Somoza regime in Nicaragua, and Somoza was what would you call him? A pupil, a star pupil of the Marines in Nicaragua that had trained him and created the National Guard. He's the chief of the National Guard. And then he creates his own dynasty there that would last until 1979. We have in Dominican Republic, Trujillo, who was also a star pupil of the Marine occupation. He was also a dictator almost through, more than 30 years until 1961 when he was assassinated because he was no longer useful to the United States. And we have Batista in Cuba in the 1930s. We have Brazil's Vargas, who was, of course, his own animal and was not installed by the U.S. Marines. Yay for sovereignty. All of those people got state visits to Washington. And the Good Neighbor policy, yes, it helped fuel the U.S. war machine against the Nazis and the fascists. But it also enabled a kind of extending or deepening of the inequalities of the economies that we had helped to create. And we stabilized those dictatorships. So were we about democracy there? No, we were about our own personal state interests, national interests, and all of that intervention is just still another way of instilling the form of regime that is the most useful to U.S. corporate interests and useful to the kind of economic power and political power that the United States wields. So I think that has to be taken into account. I think the only exception is really the Jimmy Carter years, where he tried to reverse course. And it was not just a concessionary policy of putting human rights at the top of the game for the State Department. It was an effort to reverse the harm that we had inflicted and to recognize those harms, to allow Panama not to get back its canal and not to hold part of its country in perpetuity and have a school of the Americas there, which had no accountability either to the United States people nor to anybody else. It's like a secret location where we could train 57,000 officials of U.S. or rather of Latin American militaries. Once we didn't have Panama to do it in, we moved it to Georgia. The School of Americas was closed because of citizens demanding that it be closed and their representatives in Congress, but it came at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans' lives that were destroyed by dictatorships in Argentina, in Brazil, in Paraguay, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala. I mean, I don't see that the United States really has a leg to stand on when it comes to the idea that we're somehow affecting positive change through interventionism when we're hiding the reasons that we are, or we're denying the reasons that we are intervening. So at least Trump is honest. What he's interested in is real estate, and he's interested in resources, and that's all he's interested.
Okay. Hold on.
I think Alejandro, we'll get to you in a second, but Reid's got to speak
I'm gonna
here.
mute myself.
We cannot say that at least he's honest. I mean, it's been one lie after another for the last 10 years. I mean, he is open about that aspect of U.S.
I was
imperialism.
being ironic.
I know, I understand. And I remember the second difference between Panama and Venezuela. The Panamanian Congress made the huge mistake of declaring war on the United States shortly before the intervention. This made it much easier for the Bush administration to then push through and do the invasion. Any warlike acts in the case of Venezuela had been entirely on the part of the United States. Alejandro is absolutely right to point to the loss of life during the intervention itself, plus over 100 people killed in the bombing of the civilian boats and the bombing of the port of La Guaira before that intervention. So similarities between the two, but some important differences as well.
Thanks for reminding us of that. And maybe this is a perfect segue to Alejandro.
Yeah, no, I think just to remind us of the question and to what extent does this intervention and the capture of Maduro speak or resonate with prior examples of U.S. intervention. And certainly the one that comes to mind is what Lillian and Reid have already mentioned, 1989 in Panama for the reasons that they both laid out so well. But there are elements here that seem somewhat sui generis and not novel, but they speak to something that feels different. On one hand, as Jurgen was talking about before, there are strong resonances and echoes of that moment of gunboat diplomacy or of a kind of naked ambition expressed in things like the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution after 1902. But there's also this moment of collaboration between the current authorities that were also, again, to reiterate the point, not very different from the old authorities, right? So this isn't the changing of a guard and the imposition of a puppet regime that you would have expected would have come hand in hand with the chosen opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who was the Nobel Peace Prize laureate from last year, who, did everything that she possibly could, including giving her Nobel Peace Prize medal to Trump in order to try to curry favor and then become the person that would lead this transition or whatever this moment is in Venezuela. So this certainly feels different. It doesn't feel like your conventional regime change operation. It also doesn't feel completely like the kind of moment of pressure through a Damocles sword of additional intervention. There are many signs leading up to January 3rd that the Venezuelan authorities, including Maduro, but those now in power, we're already seeing much of what we've seen in terms of changes to hydrocarbons law, changes to the release of political prisoners as part of an attempt to negotiate some kind of non-military intervention. But as Lillian and others have said, the United States needed to flex these muscles, right? Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, needed quite literally, as he goes around trying to flex the power of the United States as well as his own, muscular whatever, he needed to flex his sense of presence, military presence in a new moment for the United States, which I do think speaks to what is most resonant here. And here's what Lillian mentioned, which I completely agree with. It's not just the brazenness with which the Trump administration has articulated its motives, which I think leaves certainly me, who's been trained to think about reading between the lines and subtext and looking at the declassified documents. Why are they telling me things so clearly? Maybe there's something else that I'm not seeing. I'm just not used to the kind of openness with which they're articulating their aims. But there is a sense that the hemisphere, which is to say the Western hemisphere, is in some ways the dominion of the United States, right? And this sort of harkens back all the way to that moment in 1823 of the Monroe Doctrine, that we, as the United States, ascribe to ourselves a sense of dominion over the entire hemisphere. And that seems very resonant here, right? Not just in Venezuela, but in terms of also pushing out others that might want to make a claim.
Sorry about that. It's a little hard sometimes to get right off of mute. We're going to come back to that because I think you're onto something. But I do want to hear from Jurgen on this question of parallels with some of these better known, if you will, historical interventions. Just to see if there's anything else we're missing, Jurgen, from your point of view.
Yeah, so my first response, Ben, was that it was sui generis, and I agree with Alejandro. It's the only case where the U.S. goes in and just violates the country's sovereignty and takes the leader out. It's as sui generis as the William Walker regime in Nicaragua, is that it never happened again that a U.S. citizen actually became a president of another Latin American country. But then when I thought about my own field of expertise, it reminded me of an episode in the Mexican Revolution that failed but tried to do the same thing, and that was the punitive expedition sent by President Woodrow Wilson to capture Pancho Villa. Because we don't need, and it actually kind of leads me on a scary tangent, because at the same time that we're thinking about the intervention in Venezuela, Trump is, of course, also threatening to go after Mexican drug lords on Mexican territory. So I think we need to not just confine ourselves necessarily to the question of regime change or the university going after regimes or presidents, but we need to talk about the more general tendency, of course, of the United States basically violating Latin American sovereignty and going in and seizing an individual in that country. And so the reason why the Pancho Villa story is so interesting is that it's the third intervention in a row of three in a period of 4 years, 3 years actually, 3.5 years. So the first one was, of course, the Pact of the Embassy, where the U.S. ambassador Henry Lane Wilson decides that the democratic regime of Francisco Madero has to go, and he makes a pact with a corrupt general, basically to replace Madero, and he's later killed. The second is a year and a half later, Wilson seizes the port of Veracruz, basically intervening directly in the Mexican Civil War, and it's an intervention that ends up favoring the faction of Venustiano Carranza, which obtains weapons by that occupation. The reason why the punitive expedition is interesting is not only does the United States go in and presume that it has the right to seize a Mexican and his people just because this Mexican, he did cross the border and attack the town of Columbus, New Mexico. But the United States did this to pursue broader aims, basically to prevent the Mexicans from challenging U.S. hegemony in Mexico and elsewhere in the hemisphere. And so it's a case in which a little intervention the overthrow of a president, had led to more intervention and then even more intervention. And the crazy thing is that, of course, this intervention in 1916 completely backfired. It turned an agrarian revolution that had basically political and agrarian aims into a nationalist revolution. The first Latin American constitution that contains trammels on U.S. investments is the Mexican Constitution in Article 27. And I would argue, and most other Mexican historians of the revolution would also argue, that without these series of interventions, the Mexicans don't assert such a nationalist position in their own position. What worries me now is that, of course, the assertion that basically the United States can intervene wherever and whenever, including removing the citizens of another country and flying them home to the United States, is that I worry, as a borderlands historian, that we see this repeated in basically the United States removing people they label terrorists or criminals from Mexico and flying them back in the United States. And if that happens, what seems sui generis and really a new stage in U.S. imperialism may become a new norm. And I think that we as inhabitants of this country is something we really need to keep an eye out and really need to resist.
Jurgen, those are fascinating parallels. And you and Alejandro combined have started to move me to kind of my next kind of big topic here, because you're talking about sovereignty, you're talking about a kind of a potential new world order that's in some ways drifted from a history and legacy. Policymakers have recently put a pin and has started to describe the Don-roe Doctrine. And for our audience, once again, this is a doctrine that has been framed as a more assertive approach to hemispheric security, combining legal prosecution, targeted military action, economic coercion. Maybe I'll start with Jurgen on this, because you kind of led us a bit there with your previous analysis. How should we now begin to think about this doctrine? And especially, some of the things that you just said in terms of interventionism then also has a reciprocal impact on frameworks of national sovereignty, internal conversations about nationhood. How do we then think about this Don-roe Doctrine really widely and in historical terms?
So the Don-roe Doctrine reminds me probably the most of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which of course also had to do with Venezuela, because the United States unilaterally asserted the right basically to commit preemptive intervention to prevent the Europeans from violating the Monroe Doctrine. And so it was a preventive corollary that said, basically, if we see the risk of European gunboat diplomacy, then we're going to step in. And so it is, I would say that that is the closest parallel, because it's an assertion of U.S. unilateralism. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823, even though it's read aggressively, backward in time, at the time was defensive. At the time, the United States had realistic fear of Russian imperialism, of British imperialism, of other colonial powers. And so in many ways, the United States was not a great power and was acting multilaterally, even in the assertion of the original Monroe Doctrine. But what's interesting about the Roosevelt corollary, it was really the first time that unilateralism was asserted. The difference between then and now is that Roosevelt was basically asserting this doctrine assured of his very strong ties with other Latin American leaders. And so one doctrine that most of you probably haven't heard about is the Porfirio Diaz doctrine of 1896, in which Porfirio Diaz, of course, a much maligned and long-tenured dictator of Mexico, asserted in an address to Congress that basically the Monroe Doctrine was actually perfect if each of the Latin American countries basically passed a similar doctrine, vowing to defend each other.
Mhm.
So basically, almost 50 years before the OAS, Porfirio Diaz argued, let's take the Monroe Doctrine and turn it into a hemispheric defense mechanism. And true to that, I mean, both McKinley and Roosevelt basically conferred with major Latin American powers in questions of gunboat diplomacy. And as we know, Roosevelt and Diaz collaborated in peacekeeping in Central America. From what I can see, this Don-roe Doctrine is all unilateral. Is that there's no interest at all with negotiating anywhere in Latin America. It's a naked and brazen assertion of U.S. hegemony over the hemisphere.
Let me invite Lillian and Reid perhaps to kind of just chime in a little bit on this. The Don-roe Doctrine, I mean, how do these types of doctrines function ideologically, kind of in the United States and Latin America? Do they tend also to reinforce racialized or civilizational hierarchies, especially in how the United States begins to engage with Latin America? Kind of any thoughts? Either one of you might want to take that on.
Well, I always have something to say. Would you like to go first? Reid.
No, Lily, go ahead. I'll come in after.
Okay, so I would say first, most Americans have never heard of either the Monroe Doctrine or the Roosevelt Corollary. And most of my students, at least in the state of Florida, apparently the curriculum here has eliminated any reference. They're all brilliant students and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And so, in fact, his reference, when heard in a context of informed young Americans, sounds horrifying. Because most Americans believe, I think, from whatever source they might get that we are committed to fairness. Most of us, I think, who are Latino or maybe African American or in some way have struggled in this world, no longer believe whole scale in the American dream. We think it's a fiction, we think it's a myth, or we think it's an ideal, and it's not easily achievable. So, but we do like to think that we act fairly. And so this is, I think, just there's no fairness involved. There's not even a discourse of fairness. There's no discourse of democracy. There's no real ideology. I mean, I think it's the absence of ideology and the absence of words, at least a coherent string of them, that makes this so disturbing. I also want to say that in response to Reid's invitation that we consider, the Latin American populations in the United States. I mean, I personally wonder if we are going to continue to keep the border closed for the near future. I mean, all of us are thinking, oh, well, the Democrats will just reverse it if we just win the presidency. Well, we're not sure that that'll happen, and we're not sure that we'll win the presidency. So if we keep the borders closed, we have to think about how often countries rely, certainly Cuba has always relied on a safety valve of immigration. And keeping all of those people stuck there, is really going to have some impact. There's no question that the 2.8 million Cubans that have left in the last 3 years, 800,000 of them ended up in South Florida by 2023. That is a story. That is astonishing. The whole island only had 11 million. So, maybe 11 and a half. So there's so much more to say about that, my favorite country. But all these countries where you have a generalized crisis, it's not like the crisis is going away and things are easier now that people can't leave. So I think that has to be considered because it's not in the calculus at all. The United States has provided not just jobs, but the opportunity to flee regimes that have found themselves unaccountable to their populations and generally are now better armed than ever before. And will be even less accountable to their populations and are going to see those populations who don't leave as targets. The proliferation of gangs, and gangs are always linked. They're not just independent entities. They're always linked to paramilitaries. The gangs in Haiti, 90% of them are all ex-police officers, or they are current police officers. And we trained the police. We replaced the military in Haiti in 1995, 1996. Clinton's administration did. We replaced them with the National Police Force. And so we have created a problem in Haiti. The only thing that Haitians don't lack is guns. There are 500,000 guns in Haiti. Guns haven't stopped going to Haiti. Blackwater, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, is currently in Haiti. So I feel like the crises that are happening in these countries, are intimately linked to the racial ideologies that have resulted in their extraction or their deportation or their intimidation, their inability to flee. And then the reality is that that will have some impact on the internal political developments of these places. And one can only wonder, what the response of this administration will be, or the consequent administration will be if it remains in the hands of some of its architects, like Marco Rubio or Vance. And so that would be my comment in response to this.
Reid?
All righty. I want to thank Jurgen for informing us of the Porfirio Diaz doctrine. That was news to me. I had not heard about that. It does make perfect sense because the response by Latin American governments to the Monroe Doctrine during the 1800s was overwhelmingly positive. They saw it as the United States making common cause with them to prevent the reassertion of imperial control over the Americas. And so they were very much on board with it. The reaction was quite positive. The turning point came, as Jurgen says, in 1904 with the Roosevelt Corollary, which interestingly, it's very, I was about to say reminiscent, it's very anticipatory of the Trump approach in asserting the power to intervene, but it does at least note the conditions for such intervention, which are cases of chronic wrongdoing by Latin American governments. That condition has to be met before the United States is going to go in. The Trump approach, as stated in the National Security Strategy of November 2025, is completely open-ended. The condition simply is that of US superiority. There's nothing that goes on in Latin America that either triggers or retards that principle. And I want to try to find the specific words. I did have them written down. All right. That strategy claims unlimited, quote, preeminence in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to in the region, anywhere, anytime. And folks, just as 25 years, more or less, after the proclamation of the Roosevelt Corollary, the US had to walk that back. And it walked it back in a most interesting way, going back to the Monroe Doctrine and saying, that doctrine was really not about Latin America at all. It was aimed at Europe. And it certainly never asserted the right of the United States to intervene in Latin American nations. We overstepped. We are now going to reverse course, and we renounce the right to intervene. That was in 1930, reiterated in 1934. Folks, I have a prediction to make. Good Lord, we don't do that, do we? But no, I'm going to go ahead and make it. Just as the US had to walk back the Roosevelt Corollary, it for sure is going to have to walk back this current business that is going on. The unilateralism, the aggressiveness, the open rapacity, etc. We're going to have major, major work to do in terms of trying to make repairs in the relationship between the United States and the region, which are just being torn apart. Folks, we're going to have to make major repairs to the United States if we ever get the opportunity. But for sure, this, I don't even want to call it the Don-roe Doctrine. Let's call it the national security approach. That is going to have to be reversed at some point in the future. May it be soon.
Well, I'm going to close this with Alejandro. Alejandro, any thoughts from your perspective, and maybe even from a kind of a Venezuelan focused perspective? We kind of opened with the capture of Maduro, and we've got only a couple of minutes left here before we have to wrap it up for tonight. This has been a wonderful conversation, but Alejandro, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks. This actually piggybacks a little bit on what Reid was just saying in terms of what may happen in the future. I also have a hesitation about defining anything not only associated with this particular administration as doctrinal. It feels far more, I mean, yes, the national security strategy conveys a sense of preeminence and power and authority, no doubt, but specifically thinking about Trump himself as doctrinal feels somehow inapt. That said, One of the most remarkable, and I would say surprising in a very disappointing way, responses to January 3rd, what happened in Venezuela, is the regional response, which is to say it was extremely muted. We had a few, somewhat strongly worded statements from Colombia's President Gustavo Petro, from Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, Lula in Brazil, perhaps somewhat. But in terms of other countries, the incoming administration at the time in Chile, Cast, obviously the Milei administration in Argentina, there was not just support, but effusive support. And that, I think, speaks to a different moment in Latin America, which is not to say that the region as a whole has at any moment been completely united, but at least on the principle of sovereignty, right? That there could be some lip service paid to it. And the fact that there wasn't even lip service paid at this moment to the violation, the direct violation of sovereignty, suggests that it's not just the United States that will need repair or that will need, transformation, whatever happens in the next few years. The region itself needs to come to terms with what sovereignty means, if it's going to mean anything in the 21st century, and not just vis-a-vis the United States, but others as well. So that certainly is not an optimistic assessment, but I think it's an honest appraisal of what January 3rd meant, not just for Venezuela, but for the region more broadly. And it doesn't leave me with a lot of happy feelings, but it certainly seems to be where we are at the moment.
Well, Alejandro and my incredible panel, we're going to have to leave it at that because these are big topics, deep topics. We could go on and on for weeks, and each of you could probably write a thesis on these topics. But I want to thank our distinguished panel and turn things over now to the executive director of the American Historical Association. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much. This unfortunately has to conclude History Behind the Headlines for today on U.S. intervention in Latin America. I want to really thank all of our speakers for this engaging conversation and for sharing your expertise with us today. For those of you who have been listening, if you're already an AHA member, thank you. And if you're not a member yet, we hope you'll consider joining us to support programs like this. A recording of today's event will be emailed to you when it's available. Any questions or feedback can be sent to ahaonline@historians.org. Thank you all so much for joining us today.